So you've had an exciting week, right? You've gone to visit these companies that are famous and successful, and they have made their founders wealthy with more money than I would ever know what to do with. Uh, and you know, the message I want to leave you with is that, it's great for them, but, there are only a small number of companies out of all of us startups that achieve a good level of success. Not necessarily the success that NVIDIA has had or something, but, decent success. But I thought I would tell you a little bit about some of what I've done and some observations. Also, let's keep this very informal. I've divided my life between academia and industry. So I came to Berkeley when I was 17. So I went to school at Berkeley. I grew up back east, which is a different world. So I did a bachelor's degree in math and physics at Berkeley, and then I went to computer sciences in the frozen Midwest in Madison, Wisconsin, and immediately came back here because 3 winters was enough. It's bad. So eventually I ended up at the University of California, San Francisco, which is very well known. If you get sick in California, it's the place to go. It's the biggest research university, one of the 2 biggest research universities in the country, along with one back east. And so they have locations all over San Francisco. And we had a program started there called Medical Information Science, Informatica Medical. And it was very early. We were one of the very first. And so I was on the faculty there and became professor. And then I had this idea about, while I was there, I also taught software courses at Berkeley. So operating systems and then this may be before your time, but there was Berkeley Unix. And out of Berkeley Unix, of course, came Linux. But I was an early user of Berkeley Unix. And so I had an idea for a product based on some work I was doing. And I got it all started up and got a couple of people working for me. And eventually it looked like it was going to be successful. And so I left my tenured faculty position to go create this startup. And one of the lessons is that I didn't know very much about sales and marketing. I didn't know how to run a company, really. I was a professor, right? And so I could raise some money from my research and, but not run a business, not hire an executive salesperson or a vice president of finance, or some of the things that you have to do as you create a startup. So in any event, we survived. We got venture capital. We grew to about 200 people and so I ran the company for about 10 years. And then I was chairman for another 3. We were one of the first 100 .coms. So that tells you that we were very early at this. And so eventually the venture capitalists decided that they knew better what we should do than we knew. So they merged us with a couple of other companies and I went away. And it was just the time of this huge .com boom when everybody who had this much of an idea was able to raise money. And then in 2000, it all collapsed. Okay. I ended up going to work with running a West Coast lab for a company that built a Java Enterprise Edition application server. Those things are no longer being used very much, maybe in some big enterprises, but we made mobile devices talk to the app server. That was 25 years ago, so we didn't have anything like this, right? So we actually left the country to go buy good phones and to have mobile access to the internet. It was all kind of fun. The management of that company, which is a wonderful little company, they made a fatal error. They sold the company to Hewlett Packard. And they could have sold it to anybody and done better than selling it to Hewlett Packard. But anyway, so we survived 19 months at Hewlett Packard. Then we were, they waved us all goodbye. They don't know how to do software. And we were a software business. So too bad. Eventually I ended up at Carnegie Mellon, Silicon Valley. which has a master's degree in software management. The curriculum that I put together, and I taught there for 18 years. But along the way, I started doing more advising, and you can tell from what I've said already that I knew that tech founders needed help, because I had gone through this learning experience of, how do you market your products? How do you compete? How do you sell? How do you close a deal? Where do you need a physical office? Who are your partners? All these questions that come up as you grow from 3 people to be a much larger company. So this was all very useful, right? And so I've used that knowledge to advise others, right? It's not that we were a huge success. We did okay. But, you have to go through these steps, and you have to learn each step of the way as you create a bigger company. So we were in 4 countries, and, you have to obey by the law in Germany and in France and in the UK. And each, of course, has their own laws. This was before the EU really became as centralized with its own regulations as it is today. So we learned a lot every step of the way. And now here I am, right? So I work in open source software. I have since 1980, a long time ago. And so I'm interested in evaluation and use and adoption of open source software. And in fact, I'm going to Bangkok the week after. 2 weeks from today, there's a conference called FOSS Asia, which is the biggest open source conference, one of the 2 biggest in Asia. The other one is Open Source India. So I'm chairing a panel there called Open Source What's Next. So I spend a lot of time working in the open source community these days. All right, so that's more than you wanted to hear about my background, right?
No,
that's good. Okay. So now we can go in a bunch. Yes, sir. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Can we start asking questions?
Sure. Ask a question.
What core lessons do you prioritize when coaching leaders and innovators?
Okay. So the question is, what's the key advice that I give to leaders or would-be leaders, right? So, there's a lot, right? Because as a leader, you have a personal style, right? Because some leaders are very, do it my way or there's the door. And there are other people who are less of a micromanager. So one thing that I do is to, have people understand what their own style is and see how that works. Because, when you put together the core members of a company, you all have to work together. You might be scattered around the world. Sometimes that's the way you organize your company, but you still have to work together. So if you get into fights over how the code should be, or who should get paid how much, or how much stock somebody gets, or who should be hired, these get in the way. So the ability to, you almost want to think about your founding team the way you would think about a marriage. The same is true of who your investors are. Right? Not all money is the same. Some people come and they have, very definite ideas, that you're going to spend it a certain way, and that you're going to support their company, maybe if it's a industry investment. Other people, venture capital firms have a schedule, a timeline, right? When people invest, there's a 10-year window for that fund. So if they're near the end of it, they want you to hurry up. So some investors are patient and some are not. And so again, in that situation, you have to make sure that it's a good match because they control you in many cases. Even if they don't have 50% of the equity, they have a big voice. Right? So the idea is so to summarize that one point, it's to make sure that you're compatible with the people who you're going to work with. Another thing that you don't that people don't do very well, you have to understand who your market is. Who's your target market? Who are your target customers? If you come from a tech background, as I did, right, you like your own technology. Boy, this is really cool. Look at this code. Well, the customers don't care. They have a problem. And they want people who can help them solve that problem, make their life easier, get their work done faster, improve the quality, better, faster, cheaper. Right? So it's also for people with a strong technical background, it's difficult to communicate with them. This is why we have a long history in software of requirements not matching the system that gets built. It's gotten better because we can build prototypes and we can put up screens and the like. But back in the day, it was very common for there to be a real disconnect between what people need. So now we talk about getting out of the building. Do you know the book by Steve Blank called The Startup Owner's Manual? It's a very good book. It's, I guess it's 20 years old now, but his point is, get out of the building, go talk to people, go talk to potential customers, understand the marketplace, how big is it, who else is playing in it, how much of a share the others have. So the key point here is to know your customer, know your potential customer at an early stage. Because if you might build something beautiful, but if nobody wants it, or if it doesn't solve real problems out there in the world, you're in trouble. Okay, so those I think are two of the key lessons. There's another book in addition to Steve Blank's book. There's a book called Get Your Startup Story Straight, and it's written by David Reamer. David Reamer, who is one of the faculty at University of California, Berkeley in the business school. So a long answer to your question. So there are two books. The first one is The Startup Owner's Manual. Okay, Steve Blank there are two authors, but Steve Blank, B-L-A-N-K, is the first author there. And the second book is Get Your Startup Story Straight. And the author there is David Reamer, R-I-E-M-E-R. I know it's spelled differently in Italian, sorry. But if you're planning to do a startup, if you want to be the entrepreneur and the founder, these are good books to read and understand. Now, the third lesson is this. Not everybody should be a founder. I taught a class for many years called The First Time Manager. And we talked about some of the basic principles of management. We talked about some of the issues that you face as a manager, whether those are funding or customer and sales or internal management. How do you hire? How do you promote? How do you dismiss people, evaluate them, and so on? Some of the students, after they took the class, they said, not for me. They'd be happy to be one of the first 10 employees, but they don't want the time or the responsibility to be responsible. The way I thought about it when I was running a company, and this was, I was lucky first time. All of the people who work for you, you can think of them as little as mouths to feed. Right? They come to work for your company because they believe in you, they believe in your product idea, they believe that it can be successful in the marketplace. Maybe they have friends who work there. But when they join, right, you are responsible for them and their family, right? So, when you hire somebody, you're going to pay them a salary. That means that they and their family, whatever it may be, can afford the place to live, they can buy food, they can maybe have a car. And when they lose their job, that all goes away. So the idea of what it takes to be a leader, to be the chief executive of a company, is something you need to think about. You need to think about what it is you want to do in this world and what you're good at. Now, some people, I will give you Mark Zuckerberg as an example. He was 19 years old, and it's more than 20 years ago now. He did everything right, mostly right. I mean, I'm not a fan of the company, but when you think about it, not many people can be a CEO of a company for 20 years. and to grow it from a university dormitory to this huge multinational, multi-billion-dollar business. But he's the exception to the rule. Okay. So know yourself and know what you want is, to me, a very important piece of deciding whether you want to be the founder. Now, one of the things might be that you have an idea, but you don't want to run the business. So maybe you partner with somebody. You know, it's very common to find things like a technical person and a business person. Okay. Apple, maybe, right, with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Well, Steve Wozniak to this very day is a techie. But Steve Jobs, he was a really, I don't think he was a great manager, but he was really an excellent marketer. He knew what customers wanted. Sometimes he didn't even talk to them. He said, oh, they're going to love this phone. Okay. So, that combination of somebody with business experience and somebody who could be the technical leader. And you can see that Apple continued that way. And they had some very, very talented people on the technical side. And then you can see that as an operations person, it's hard to beat Tim Cook. He's just done an outstanding job. So you can find certain good examples of this. And a lot of companies don't make it because they get things wrong in the first year. They don't build the right team. They don't build the right product. They give away too much stock to the wrong people. And so, a lot of what I do as an advisor is to try to prevent companies and founders from doing that. I'm currently advising a startup, and I don't know if they're going to be successful. You never know that, of course. But what the CEO needed more than anything else was a way to describe in short, clear sentences what his product was, what his company was. He sent me this presentation. It was horrible. And so, we started at the basics. Tell me in one sentence what your company does. Tell me in one sentence what your product does. Tell me in one sentence why somebody would be interested in your product. Who would that be? And these are things that, I can say them and they sound obvious to you, right? But it's really hard to communicate that to somebody else because as founders and entrepreneurs, we get so close to our own ideas and we spout out all these words and they're not familiar to the people we're talking to. We have this deep knowledge of some product domain and the people we're talking to say, help me out here. I don't get it. Right? And, there are things in biotech, for example. My knowledge of biotech is, this much. And so when somebody comes to me with this whole thing about proton chains, I say, excuse me. So these are, they seem like obvious things. So does that help? All right. So as you see, I mentioned a few places where I've stopped along the way, and some good experiences and some not so good. I went to work before I went to the Java server company. I went to work for a little company here in San Francisco that had a great idea. The idea was that they were going to inspect if I had a car to sell. They would provide a service where I could sell it online. This was 1998, so a long time ago. And they hired mechanics who would go out and examine the car and evaluate it on 107 different criteria. So you would be able to see the condition of the car, and then there would be an auction. Okay. So not a bad idea. I mean, selling used cars is always painful, and if you take it to a dealer, they're not going to give you very much money for it. So the idea that you create a marketplace where I could sell my car easily, and somebody who wanted a car like that could go online, see the car, see pictures of it, see the mechanical condition of it, and feel confident about buying it, even if they had not taken a test drive. Well, okay, today we have all kinds of services like that. At the time, they were first, right place at the right time. But 3 months later, eBay, you know eBay? They started eBay Motors. Same thing. Okay, they were going to auction off used cars, in a consumer marketplace. So that kind of was going right after the same target market. And but would the company have survived? I don't know. The CEO and the president were not very experienced. Okay. They had worked they were Stanford MBAs. They had worked in a consulting company together for 4 years, but they had no other hands-on operational business experience. So one of the things they did very early, they needed a site built, right, to do all of this. Well, here's one of these first-year errors. They hired one company to build the front end, and they hired a different company to build the back end, right? Because those took different talents. Okay, so, all right. And the company building the back end, these were all Indian programmers who came to the US to work on this project. And were they good? Yeah, there were some good ones there. So, but my job as VP of engineering, well, it was to get the equipment, it was to keep the system up and running, and to coordinate with the two groups that were building it. So this was an idea that may have been a good idea as a concept, but which failed in reality for several reasons. One is the competition in the marketplace. Another one is the leadership. They raised money, no problem raising money. They knew that all they had to do was say Stanford MBA, and somebody would write them a check, because it was that period of the huge boom in .com, and only a few companies survived that boom. Right? Yahoo came from 1994. Google started in 1998. So there were a few that started then and not only survived, but did quite well. But most of the others went away in 2000 or 2001 because the market disappeared. The funding disappeared. And so we have these waves of investment. Right now, if you go to a venture capitalist's office with a business plan that says AI, they're going to write you a check. Maybe not a big check, but they'll write you a check. How many of those companies are going to survive? Well, hard to say. Is OpenAI going to survive? Or are they going to get acquired by Microsoft? Or are they going to make some fatal error? Or are the others going to come and catch up with them? DeepSeek and Anthropic and the others. So it's, you look at this situation, you never quite know. You have to kind of say, well, the world is going that way. And if you're part of that, great. But if you were going this way, maybe you lose. Not because you have a bad product, but because the world is focused on that. So, okay. How are we doing? All right. More thoughts, questions? Is this interesting?
Yes.
Okay. We don't want to put you to sleep this early in the day. Excuse me. So I went to this .com startup. I went to another. So I went to Bluestone at HP for a couple of years, and then again when Hewlett-Packard decided that they didn't like middleware, we were all out there doing something else, and eventually I got asked to advise a 3-person startup. And their idea, again, was fairly interesting. And it's something that's much easier to do now than it was in 2003. They wanted to be able to let an average user speak or write down some text, and then of what they wanted the product to do. And then they would take that text and transform it into a use case diagram. Everybody know what a use case diagram is? Okay. So, and then so the use case diagram was the first step toward capturing the real requirements for a product. Sounds great, yes? Okay. So what didn't work? Several things didn't work. First of all, they got a little bit of money, not a lot, but enough to pay the rent and to pay a couple of salaries. And so they weren't struggling. But when I got there, just to give you an idea of where they were on the maturity scale, they had 2 computers, one for each of the technical people. The other people brought their own machines, connected to the network. But all of the source code and all of the executables for their product were on one machine. Not backed up, nothing. If that machine went down, they would have to start over. Not very smart, right? So that kind of tells you where they were in the whole scheme of things. And, you know, they brought me into, I think my title was VP of Product Development. But these guys already knew what they wanted in their products. So they weren't all that receptive to new ideas. So that didn't go so well. But again, they survived a little while. But eventually, what they discovered was that people don't do a very good job of describing what they want the product to do. And, you know, to turn it into a use case diagram, you have to be precise. You know, because you need to understand who the actors are, right, and what are the activities and the sub-activities. And if you can't do that, and you can't describe a sequence, for example, of activities and who are the players, you can't generate a use case diagram that's any good. And if you can't do that, you're dead, right? Because nobody knows how to work from a broken use case diagram or an incomplete one. So you sort of have all these actors up there that you can, you know, display in your output, but they're not connected to anything. So teaching users how to describe what it is they want their product to do, that's a big challenge. And we see that in a lot of what's going on now with Gen AI. You give a prompt, you get back an answer. Well, maybe the answer isn't quite right. Okay. But the better Gen AI systems let you explain what it is you wanted, to add on, to clarify, and eventually you kind of head in the right direction, usually. Okay. How about Copilot? How many of you have tried using Copilot? All right, how successful were you? Exactly. So it's a start in the right direction, but it doesn't generate very good code. Right? And so, in fact, the code that's generated these days by these kinds of systems are not very efficient. They don't run very efficiently. They use a lot of space. The source of the code that they use is not clear. There are licensing problems with the code because some of it's open source, some of it might be proprietary because somebody put something online. So we're not there yet. Again, it's a good idea, but one of the things that's in common in all of these examples I've used is that they've gotten some things right. They have the big picture of what they want to do, but things get in the way. The technology may be not mature. The market may not be mature and not well understood. There may be other problems in the way. I'll give you an example from long, long ago. I was working on a system advising a group of pharmacists who were trying to build a system for the hospital that kept track of all the prescriptions for all the patients and what drugs they were taking. And, you know, so they had the formulary of all the drugs, they had the list of all the patients, and then, you know, patient A is taking drug B and so on. Great. All right, that's pretty simple actually. Okay. But there were 2 problems. One problem is that the doctors at that time they wouldn't type. So here was a terminal where they could enter the prescription for the patient, but they wouldn't type because typing was something that women did. Now, really, this was at a time when the doctors were men and the nurses were women. Today we have some overlap, right? A lot of overlap. But in the United States, we had this very clear split. So what happened was it became a very inefficient system. The doctor would say, okay, this medication for this patient, this many doses, this many refills, and then write that down on paper and then pass it to the nurse, who was probably doing something else. And would that get entered in? No. So the whole process of data entry was a mess. The second thing, which was discovered later, actually discovered in time, the pharmacist said, if my patient is taking this drug and this drug and this drug, sometimes they interfere with each other. There are interactions. There are drugs that you shouldn't take together because one of them makes the other not work or makes it work too well or something. So they independently came up with this new requirement, which was very important and very valuable. But it changed the requirements for the system because all of a sudden you needed to have sets of drug-drug interactions. And so you could, when a patient was prescribed two of these drugs that had an interaction, then you needed somebody to come in and take action, decide what to do, and so on. So it made for a system that was much more complex. It took much longer to do, cost more money, needed more people, all these kinds of things. So there are all kinds of things that can go wrong. Okay, and so that, to me, is one of the reasons why you see all of these startups, hundreds, thousands of them. I'm an advisor at Berkeley Skydeck. For the last group, they take like 20 companies for their accelerator, for their main accelerator round. They had 2,000 applications. 1% get accepted. 2,000 startups. What are they going to do? So the numbers are big. So, if you're going to do a startup, you have to be very dedicated and you have to really know what you want to do, understand the requirements, and be able to communicate it. Okay. So communication is another critical skill. And you have to know who your audience is. Because if I'm talking to an investor, the investor is going to care about the growth of the market, the size of the market, who's the competition, how are you going to beat them, right? How long is this going to take? What's your revenue plan? How much money you're going to need? Right, a whole bunch of questions like that. And you have to be able to answer them. When you're talking to a potential customer, they don't really, they want to know if you're going to be around next month, but they don't really care about the details of how you're going to raise the money. They want to know what features are in the product and when it's going to be available to them and how much it's going to cost to subscribe or to license the software. So if I'm trying to talk to people as a leader in a company, I have to know who my audience is. And I have to adjust my presentation accordingly. You had a question?
I had questions about, you met so many leaders probably and CEOs. What are the signs you see that they're going to be successful or not? Or signs of a great leadership?
What are the qualities of somebody who makes a great CEO? I can't give you a good answer to that because there are people out there in the world who are CEOs and I can't imagine how they got there. But one thing that's really important, one of the things I've said for years is you can't be a leader if you can't get anyone to follow you. Okay? So you have to be maybe charming, but you have to be convincing. You have to be clear in how you speak. And you have to understand who your audience is. So if I want to hire you to be my VP of engineering, and I like your qualifications on your resume and we talk or interview and you talk to a couple of my other people, now I have to sell the company and the position to you because you're in demand, right? So I want to hire you, but if you're good enough for me, you're good enough for a lot of other people too. So I have to be able to go out there and say, here's why you should join us. So one of the things about a good CEO is the ability to understand the various audiences that that he encounters or she encounters, and sell. One of the strange things in this business is that we're always selling. We're selling ideas, we're selling a product, we're selling ourselves. There are a lot of different kinds of activities that go on to be successful as a CEO. And if you don't have that, then you don't do as well. You may not fail because some people like to be ordered around. Do this for me by Monday or else, right? Okay, we've seen that in our government. We've seen that in corporate leadership. And other people like to be said, we need to deliver this next week. So, keep that in mind. Yes?
Maybe just to turn around the prior question, what would you say were the most common mistakes, pitfalls, or lacking character traits in founders that led to the failure of the startup?
Again, let me qualify this. Sometimes people who have bad character traits are going to be successful. I mean, people talked about Steve Jobs as being very difficult, right? And so if you were to look at his actions, his behavior, the way he treated people, you would say, why would anybody work for him? He was so demanding and such a perfectionist. But there are people who like that. So really what's more important is to assemble a bunch of people with whom you're compatible. And there are people who work for Elon Musk. I mean, why do they do this? You may as well stick needles in yourself. So it's hard for me to answer your question. But obviously, being a good leader means that you tend to have more of an outgoing personality than an ingoing one. You tend to be more of an extrovert than an introvert. If you want to write, there are a lot of people today, all of their interaction in the world is through a machine, right? Through screens. And they're not very good in a one-on-one social situation. Those people probably should not be CEOs, okay? Because interacting with the world is an important part of being the leader. You have to go out there and sell your company. You have to raise money. You have to sell your product. You have to compete. Maybe you have to do interviews for podcasts or press releases or something like that. You have to be out there. So some people can learn to do it. They can switch. You can be taught to a certain extent to be a better manager and a better communicator. You also have to learn how to speak. There are a lot of people, you speak to them or they get up in front of an audience. First of all, they're afraid to do it. More women than men for reasons that I don't understand. But that is what happens. But in the middle of a sentence, they say, or like, or they don't get through a complete sentence. And that's, to me, poor communication because I notice that they haven't spoken a complete sentence. And one of the people I know who did this is a wonderful, brilliant person who has a Nobel Prize. But the first time I heard her speak, it was terrible. But what's happened in the meantime is I know that she got training in public speaking so that she didn't kind of stop in the middle of every sentence to say, it's distracting. If you can speak in complete sentences. And sometimes you end up talking very fast because there's so much in there that wants to come out. But that communication skill and the ability to interact with people. So if I see people who can't do that, I'll advise them that they need help on that, but that's a bad sign to me. That's one important one. Okay. The other one is, the easiest word is micromanaging. You have to let go. If you're the CEO, fine. On day one, you're writing all the code, you have all the ideas. As you grow, you have to let go. One of the most common things I say as an advisor is a CEO who's still writing code. Okay. You can't do that. there are other things to do. Right? So as soon as you bring in somebody who's a lead developer or your first salesperson, you have to let most of that go. You have to delegate. And you have to build a team of people that you rely on. If you bring in a VP of sales and the VP of sales doesn't do well, if the revenue doesn't increase the way that you hope, time to make a change because you've lost trust. You need to have that kind of communication and trust in your leadership team. Okay. What else do I have to say? I don't have much else to add. If there's one more question, I'll be glad to do it. We'll take two. So you go first.
How do you think your experience in academia and as a professor also helped you in all this journey we just talked about?
So how does my experience in academia help me in running a business? And I guess the short answer is it doesn't help very much because they keep score differently. If you're a professor, then how do they measure you? They measure you on the amount of money you can raise from grant sources or foundations. They measure you on the number of publications that you've written and how many publications there are in top journals. But the one place where it is helpful is you get this experience teaching. So you have to be able to take a complex idea and remember that you're trying to explain it to people who don't have as much knowledge in the topic as you do. So the ability to organize your thoughts and to present the ideas in an orderly way, that I think is one of the things that comes from academia. The other thing that comes from academia is that, as happened in my case, was I had a research idea that I thought would be valuable as a product in industry. And so I was brave enough to leave the university to go try to make a success of that business. So the idea that you have the freedom to do your own research and potentially create ideas. And you'll see that if you go to a school like Berkeley or some other top universities, there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity. There are a lot of professors who have a business on the side. Did I answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay, you're last.
During your years of experience, have you found any trends, any way to find the technological trends would be successful and that would not be allowed?
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Try that again.
So if you have found any successful way to identify a trend, a technological trend such as AI or things like that,
so can you be ahead of the curve?
Yeah.
Yes and no. Because you may find something that, because you're on program committees for conferences and you see people who are doing work in interesting areas, or you go to a conference and people are presenting leading edge research. So if you're in a research-centered university, not a teaching school, then you, in fact, have awareness of what's new and what's happening in a particular field. But do you know enough to act on it? Do you know enough about the entrepreneurial side, the business side, that you can say, here's my idea. I can take building on this research and go build a company that will be successful. And one of the things that we see is that whatever idea you start with in a company, it changes as you grow. Partly because there's competition, partly because the world is continually changing, partly because you have customers who come and ask you for things that you hadn't previously thought about. So what you may do in the research setting is a starting point, but you need to think about where you want to go, what's going to be out there a few years in the future. Okay, well, it has been my pleasure once again to speak to Silicon Valley Fellowship, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay. And so thank you.